In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off in part 1. We're going to finish our base material by adding a rust layer. And in doing so, we're going to cover some additional features here in Designer that you need to know in order to create your own materials. So let's get started with our rust. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start in this area. So let's just move these nodes down. And I'm going to start to create the pattern here for my rust. So what I'm going to do is come over to my library, and underneath the noises, we're going to use this black and white spots 2 noise. So let's do a simple left click, drag and drop to instance this node here into our graph. And so here is the node that we have, and this is the noise. Now, as I mentioned in part 1, we have our resolution set to be relative to parent. So everything we're working at with now is at 256. And as I said, that when you're designing your material, you're going to want to start with the largest resolution you think you're going to need here in your substance. So let's change that now. So again, I'm just going to double click in an empty area here in my graph to take me to the root level. So here for my output size, we're going to click this button here and set it to absolute. And I'm just going to set my resolution here to 1024 by 1024. So here in my 2D view, I can click this Fit to All button so that I can get a full view of this noise texture. Okay, so this is what we're going to start with, this noise. And so now I'd like to apply an effect to this noise. So here I'm going to hit my space bar, and I'm going to use the directional warp node. Now, this node here takes 2 inputs. An input, which is going to be our noise, and an intensity input. Now in this case, I can just connect this noise here to both of the inputs. Now, double click, make sure that we're viewing the output of this directional warp here in our 2D view, and now I can change the parameters. So here, I'm going to take my warp angle and just move this down here, so we're right about 90 here, so that's good, -90, and our intensity, let's move this all the way up. Now, as I stated in part 1, a lot of the sliders that you see here in Substance Designer have kind of a pre-built min and max setting. Here it looks like the slider stops at 16. However, I can just double click in any of the sliders to enter into a numeric entry mode, and I can choose a different value. So let's try like 64. So now you can see that I'm really able to overcrank this warp, and the slider now again adjusts itself to this new max range of 64. So here we've taken a noise and we've warped it to produce a variation of this noise. And this is a pivotal workflow here in Substance Designer, and you'll find yourself doing this very often. So now that we have the base pattern here for our rust, let's add some color. So I'm just going to zoom out here and just pan over. Here is where we actually have our base color. And what we're going to do is blend in this rust into our base color. But first, like I said, we need to colorize it. So to do that, I'm going to hit the space bar, and I'm going to come over and grab hold of this gradient map. So this gradient map takes a grayscale as input, which is what we have here. So let's make this connection. Again, left click the output, gives me my connection line, and we'll just drag and connect it here to the gradient map input. So I'm going to double click to make sure that I'm viewing the output of this gradient here in my 2D view. And you'll notice over here for my parameters, I now have this gradient. Now if I click the gradient editor button, it gives me the gradient editor. And again, we have this gradient. So what I can do here is use this node to colorize the grayscale values. So here you can see this gradient represents the dark to white values of this 2D image here. So what I can do is just click to create a key. Now notice I have a key for the black and a key for the white. So if I come over and I select this key and I choose like a red color, what this is doing is it's taking all of the dark values here that's coming in from this grayscale input, and it's just coloring them whatever color I set here at this key. So here at the opposite end of the spectrum, let's select the white and let's change it to something like, say, green. So here you can see that I've just colorized this grayscale version based on those gradient keys to get this. So here we'll go back to our gradient editor, and this just gives me a quick way to colorize a grayscale image. However, there's a better way to do this, and I'm going to show you a trick. So what we can do here, I'm just going to click this minimize button, just so that we can see here in the background I have a photo that I downloaded from online, and I can actually just sample this image directly. So let's do that. Let's come over back here to Substance Designer. We'll click the gradient editor, and I'm going to use this pick gradient button. So now I could actually have this little sample tool that allows me to sample any image. And so I'm just going to come over into this area and just do a left click and drag. And then when I let go of my mouse, you can see that the keys are automatically plot for me. And I get this really nice, sophisticated coloring of my grayscale input. And it's very easy to do this. So let's just close out the gradient editor and maximize Substance Designer. And now here you can see that we have the color of our rust. So now here we have our rust and we have our raw metal. And so what I want to do is blend these two together. So let's just organize our nodes here a little bit. Let me just take these nodes here and I'm just going to move them kind of out of the way for now. And this is our color output. And so here is our rust. Now, in order to blend two textures together, we're going to use a blend node. So here I'll hit the space bar and I'm going to choose blend. And so when we look at the blend node, it has a foreground and a background and an opacity input. So what we can do here is take our rust. We're going to put this in here in our foreground. So we'll move this out of the way. Here again, let's just reorganize these nodes just so this makes a bit more sense visually. So here we have our rust. And now I'm going to take that metal reflectance value and put that here into the background. And so when we take a look at this actual blend node, you can see that we have these blending modes. And if I click the drop down, you can see that we have a lot of familiar blending modes similar to what you would find in Photoshop, such as add, multiply, divide, and so on. But what we can do here is we can use this opacity setting. So notice that with a value of 1, we're completely seeing the foreground. And if I take this opacity slider and I push this all the way to 0, we now will see the background. First, let me just make sure I double click so that we can view that here in our 2D view. So again, at an opacity of 0, we're seeing the background, which is our metal color. And if we pull this slider all the way up to 1, we're seeing the foreground. And like I said, we could blend simply by using a blending mode or opacity, or we can supply a mask here to this opacity input. And that's what we're going to do here. So let's get started with that process. So I'm going to back out here, and here is the noise that we have here for our rust. I would actually like to just select these two nodes here, and I'm just going to hit Control-C to copy them and Control-V to paste them. And so here we have this noise. Now, another thing that we can do, so here I have my directional warp, double click, so I'm viewing that in my 2D view. I'm going to single click the black and white spots. And I want to bring your attention here to this random seed. Now, this random seed is part of the base parameters, and as I mentioned in part 1, that all nodes are going to have these base parameters that allow us to change things like specific output size for the node, its tiling mode, as well as a random seed. Now, since I just copy and pasted this node, we're getting the same pattern. So what I'm going to do just to vary this is just adjust the random seed. So here I'll set it to something like 9. So here's the texture that we're getting. Let's back out. And let's go view the previous by just double clicking to load that in the viewport. So now notice that I get a different look here to this noise. The idea here is that with this new noise pattern, I'm going to generate a mask that I'm going to use here in my blend node. So remember, we're going to use this opacity input as a mask. So I have this noise here. Now I can use the levels to create some contrast to create a better mask out of this. So here, with this node selected, I can then hit this levels button here, which is going to create the levels and automatically connect it here to that selected node. So here I'll come over to my levels and just here increase the contrast by adjusting the input black and white. And so here's what I'm getting. Now, there's another way to do this as well. So here, let me just back out into the view, and I'm going to hit the space bar, and I'm going to do a search here for a node that's very handy called the histogram scan. So let's use this node. Now, this is a custom node, just as I mentioned in the part 1 video, where a lot of these custom nodes are generated from the core nodes of Designer. So what we can do here is just make this connection again. So let's just connect our histogram scan. And now we can come over here to this position, and I can increase the position value, and you can see that that gives me an effect of almost dialing up an amount of this grayscale range. So I can increase my position, and then I also have a control here for contrast. So we'll increase our contrast up pretty high to about 0.9, and then I can bring this position value down. So like I said, this is a custom node. If I were to right click and come over here to my open reference, so here we're going to load this SBS, you can see here that this was created using the standard levels node. Again, just to reiterate, with Designer, we can take the core functionality and create all kinds of different types of custom tools. Okay, so let's use this histogram scan. Let's delete the levels, and now we've got a new node that we're able to use now, the histogram scan. So here is what we have. Now, what I would like to do is take this grayscale map that we have, and we're going to use this as our mask. So let's take this connection here. We're going to take our output and take this connection and plug that into the opacity of our blend. So now we'll just double click the blend to view it here in our 2D view. And now you can see that we're blending our rust and our metal to get this effect, and we're using this mask. Now, if I want to view this input, I can just zoom in and double click this opacity input, and this lets me see what I have here. So like I said again, we've got our foreground, our background, which is being blended by this mask. Here, for the node itself, notice my opacity, I left that to 1, and my blending mode is just set to copy, which is just basically foreground over the background. And all of the blending is happening because of this mask that I created. Okay, so now that we have that in place, let's take our base color output and make this connection here. So we'll plug this in, and then here in our 3D view, we can now see this effect. So just to make sure that this is working for you, if you don't see anything when you connect to your outputs, right click and make sure that you choose View Outputs in 3D View. So we'll do that, and you can see that quick refresh, and now everything is working. Okay, so here is our base color. And I'm just kind of cleaning up the nodes here a little bit just so that we can just get a better visual organization of what's happening so far. So what we have right now is we have our rust, and it's just placed right on top of our metal. And that's not really convincing. So what I would like to do is have this rust integrate a bit better with this corrugated metal pattern that we have. So in order to do that, I'm going to utilize a new node. So here, we're going to use our normal map. Let's just move these nodes out of the way, and let's grab our normal information here. And again, I'm just kind of organizing this so that we can just get a better kind of visual representation of what's happening here. All right, so we created our normal map. So I just double click my normal to view that here in the 2D view. Here again, we're seeing this transparency because the enable alpha is on here for our 2D view. I don't want that, so let me just come over to this button and just click this. So here we have our normal. Now, there's a node here called Curvature Smooth, and that's going to help me to create this effect. So here I'm going to hit the space bar, and I'm going to start to type here in my search, Curvature Smooth. So we've created this node here, and I'm just going to make this connection. And so here you can see what we're starting to get. So what I'm going to do with this node is I'm going to use this to help me kind of create a mask, which I'll then use to, like I said, integrate this dust into this corrugated pattern here. All right, so far you can see that this Curvature Smooth is basically giving me kind of an outline of these corrugated patterns here. But the value range is still not quite where I need it to be. So what I'm going to do is just use a levels here to help me with this. So I've got the node selected. Let's just click the levels button. And so here I've got my levels. Now what I want to do is I want to create a mask that's basically going to give me kind of the base outline of these corrugated shapes here. So I need to invert this. So a quick way to invert using a levels is to just come over here to my histogram and just swap the output black and white. So here I'm just left click dragging and just swapping the output black and white. So this is what I'm getting so far. Now what I'm going to do is just adjust my input black and white. So here, let's just move these guys in towards each other to get something like this. So now you can see that the idea here is I'm just creating a mask. If we zoom in, you can see this white area here is at near the base of this corrugated pattern. Notice the top of the pattern is black. So, you know, we're basically kind of limiting where the rust is going to be on top of this. And we're trying to concentrate some of this here. So we get this kind of mask pattern. So what I would like to do is take this and add it to the mask that we've already been creating. So let's grab these nodes here and let's just bring them down again, just so that we can kind of get everything in order. And let's use that blend node again. So I can hit my space bar and choose blend, or again, here on the top of my toolbar, I've got a blend button. So what we're going to do is with our blend, we're going to take this foreground element. This is this mask here that we're creating, and we're just going to connect that here to our foreground. We're going to take the mask that we had created previously, and that's going to become our background. So let's just left click, drag and drop this connection line right onto the background. And so now we have these two guys in place. This time we're going to use one of our blending modes, and like I said, I want to add these two guys together. So we'll just click the drop down and choose add. And so now I'm getting this mix of the two masks. So it's a little intense, so what I'm going to do is just come over here to my opacity and just start to drag this down a bit to around 0.5. And you can see that what this is doing here is just kind of lessening the effect of this mask that we just created. So here is the result of that blend. Now, one thing I would like to do is just do a little bit of reorganization of these nodes here. So let's just pull these nodes back so that we can just get some room here. Now, this histogram scan that I have, I would like to have this be the final node that I use, because as I showed earlier, this histogram scan, I'm using this position value and contrast to really drive the overall effect and intensity of this mask that's showing this rust here on our surface. So what I'm going to do is actually just take our directional warp, and I'm going to take its output, and I'm going to replace it here into my background. So I'm basically now kind of bypassing this histogram. So notice here I'm just kind of dragging this out of the way. So now here is what we get in that mixture of our corrugated pattern here mask with our noise, and now we get this effect. And like I said, I want to use this histogram scan here at the end. So now let's take the output of this effect here, these two masks being blended together, and plug this here into my histogram. And so now you can see here, if I just double click, this is the new mask that we get. And again, now the combined effort of these two masks is being controlled by this histogram scan. So if I just decrease my position, you can see this kind of cool effect where I can just kind of almost dial in the amount of rust. Also notice now that this rust is starting to kind of collect at the base of the raised areas of this corrugated pattern here, which is pretty cool. That's what I'm wanting to get here. And finally, you can see this mask is still just going right here into our blending of our opacity. So at that stage, this collection of nodes here is going to take care of our mask, as well as our normal output. Okay, so the next thing that I'd like to do is start to fix my metal. So notice here we have this mask, and these white areas in this mask are indicating where we have rust. However, here in our metal map, we have this set as just pure white. So what we're indicating to the shader with the white metal map is that everything here is metallic. Well, rust is not metallic, it's actually dielectric. So we need to account for this rust here in our metal map, and we have an easy way of doing that. So like I said, here in our mask, the white areas are denoting roughness. Well, if we just invert this mask, it's going to give us the metallic map that we want. And there's a really quick way to do that. You've already seen that we could do it with the levels node by just swapping the output black and white. However, we actually have a node for this as well. So I'm going to hit the space bar, and here in the search, I'll start to type invert, and here you see that we have this invert grayscale. Let's just use this. So here I'm going to make this connection, and now we've just inverted the mask, which is actually going to give us the correct metal map that we need. So here I'll just take this connection and just drag it right here to my metallic output. And so when I do that, you can see that the rust is now shading appropriately as it's acting as a dielectric. So we don't need this uniform color anymore. Let's just delete it. So you might be asking, well, why did you use this invert and not just the levels? Well, you could just use the levels that you want. And sometimes, as you see here with this node, when I was able to do an invert and that contrast control all within a single node, that means that's just one less node that the graph has to compute. So it's a little bit more optimized to work that way. However, a drawback of that is that if you're sharing this substance with another artist, it's not readily visible that this node is just inverting something. So it would take a little bit of an investigation to see that it's being inverted. However, here you can see that, okay, well, I did an invert, and now it's going to the output. Or if here I wanted to take this, do an invert node, then use the levels only for contrast. If you look at the readability of the graph, that makes it a little bit easier for other artists, but maybe a little less optimized because I'm doing two nodes where I could have got it done in one. So just some food for thought there. Okay, so here we have our metal map fixed. What we'd like to do now is start to work on our roughness. So I'd like to have a specific roughness for the rust and one for the metal. Well, we already have one here for our metal. Let's take a look at what we have for our roughness. So remember from part one, we used this as a roughness for our metal. Let's do something a little different here with the rust. So what I'm going to do is just come over here to the rust, And I'm just going to double click, and I think what I'll do is I'll just use this mask again to control the blending between the two different roughness values. So like I said, we already have our metal roughness. Let's come up towards where we started to create our pattern here for our rust. So here I'm going to use this guy. So what I'm going to do is just hit my space bar, and I'm going to choose a new node here called the histogram range node. And this is going to work similar to the levels, but it's going to give us just a little bit easier control here. So here, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's take this directional warp and plug it here into our histogram range. Now with this node, you can see that I can adjust the range and the position. So I'm going to bring my position up pretty high because I want this rust to be, well, pretty rough. And now I can just give a little bit of variation here in the range. So let's do something like maybe this. So this is going to be the roughness for the rust. And let's just drag this down here into position. So now again, we have two values. We have the roughness for our rust, and we have the roughness here for our metal. Let's blend these guys together. So here I'll just click the blend button to create a blend node, and we'll take the rust roughness in the foreground and the metal here in the background, and then we're just going to simply blend these here with an opacity. And like I said, we're going to use our mask here for our rust. So let's just take the output of this connection and we'll plug it right here into the opacity. So let's double click, and so now you can see the combination here of the two different roughness ranges. So now I'll take the output of this blend and plug that into my roughness. So here, let's just kind of clean things up a little bit so we can get just a better kind of visual idea of what's happening. And here we go. So another thing I would like to do here with this roughness is just kind of adjust the overall intensity value of this. I feel like it's just a bit too saturated. So let's just zoom in here to where we have our gradient map. And I'm just going to select my connection line here, and I'm just going to click this hue, saturation, and lightness node. So it's going to create that. And I'll click that button, and it's going to create the node for me. And now what I'm going to do is just kind of process this color range. So what I'm going to do is just simply drop kind of the saturation a little bit. And like I said, that's going to go a long way for creating a bit more of a realistic rust coloring because we dropped that. Now I'm also going to just pull my lightness up maybe just a little bit, get something more like this. And if I wanted to, I could adjust the hue range, but really what I want to do was just decrease that saturation. And I think that, again, gives me a better result. So now we pretty much have our graph in place. We've got all the nodes ready, and we have this nice control here. Again, if we go back to that histogram scan and I just pull this slider, you can see that we now have the ability to kind of just dial in this rust amount, which is pretty cool. So maybe we'll keep it at something like that for now. Okay, so one last thing that I want to add here is a new output, because right now we have base color. Here, let's just left click and drag our outputs and just pull these guys over so we can really see this here. So we have our base color, we have our normal, we have our roughness, metallic, and one thing that we're missing here is ambient occlusion. And so when we created our template, you'll notice that, well, we didn't have an ambient occlusion output. Well, here in Designer, you can create an output at any time. So here, I'm just going to hit my space bar, and towards the bottom, you'll see an output node. So let's just left click to create this output node here. Now we'll zoom in here so we can focus on this node, and let's take a look at the attributes. Now there's a usage attribute, and we need to set this. So I'm going to click this add button here, and it creates this drop down menu here and allows me to change the usage. So I'm going to click the drop down, and I'm going to choose ambient occlusion. So now that I have this in place, I'd also like to set my identifier. Notice that by default it just says output, which is generic. Now, when we're thinking in terms of publishing this substance for use in a host application, the substance integration, you want to make sure that you get your usage and identifier set correctly. So here I'm just going to just select this. Notice that this is a drop-down box, but it's also a cursor. We could click in here and we could type. We could even make our own kind of custom output if we wanted to. But in our case, I'm just going to select this text, just copy it, and then just come up here to my identifier and just paste it in, just so I didn't have to type it again. Now here for my label, if I just want to make sure this is labeled correctly, and this is really just visual. Here, let me just demonstrate. If I just double click an empty area here that takes me to the root level of the graph, you'll notice here that we've got our output images and we've got base color, normal, rough, and then we've got the usage here of ambient occlusion, and it's just all running together. So what I'm going to do is just select this, and for the label, I'm just going to type in ambient occlusion. And here on the node, you can see that we get a nice kind of more readable version of that. So now we have an ambient occlusion output, we need to give it some data. So let's take a look at how we can do this. And a simple way to do that here would just be to come back over to where our normal is. So here is our normal map that we've been working with. And I can create some ambient occlusion from this normal. And it's a two-step process. So first, I'm going to hit my space bar, and I'm going to start to type in normal. And you'll see that we have this option here, normal to height. Let's create this node. So now I'll just make this connection, and just like that, Substance Designer has now converted that normal to a height map. Now we can use this height map as an additional output as well. And I think we'll go ahead and do that. So here, let's just take this node and just drag it down here, just so that we can kind of line it up where this output is going to be. I keep saying, we want this to kind of be, visually clean when we work. And as you start to work and create a lot of nodes, you just make sure that you're organized. It just makes your work go faster. And again, if you're sharing these substances, it makes it more readable for other artists. Okay, so here's our height. Before we actually create a height output, what I'm going to do is hit my space bar again. And in my search, I'm going to start to type in ambient occlusion. And here I have this occlusion node. Let's select this to create the node. Now let's take our height and connect it here into the ambient occlusion. And so now I've got this ambient occlusion information. What I'm going to do here is just adjust my spreading to get something like that. And I have the ability here to run kind of a levels control and adjust the low, high, and middle frequencies here in the way that this node is going to generate this ambient occlusion. Let's just leave it like it is for now. And then let's connect this ambient occlusion data here to the ambient occlusion output. Okay, so now that I have this in place, I am going to right click, and I'm going to view outputs in 3D view because I have a new output. And so now when I do that, I start to get just a little bit of this ambient occlusion here that's being rendered from the shader. Just so you can see it, let's take our spreading and just pull this up to a real high value. So notice here, this is actually too much, but you can see the effect that it's having. So here we are without ambient occlusion, and here we are with just a little bit of that ambient occlusion in here. So maybe we'll do something like this. And as I said, we also have this height. So, now that we have the node, let's just use it. So let's create another output. So I'm going to hit my space bar, grab my output node. Here for the usage, for the add item, we'll click the plus button. We'll click this drop down and choose height. And let's come over here to our identifier. Let's type in height. And again, let's give it a label of height. So now we can take our height node and just plug this here into our output. So now we have some height information as well in case we want to use that. So just to give you an idea of how we could utilize that here in Designer, let's come back over here to our materials. Now remember, default is the name of the material ID that's associated with this cube mesh that we have here. So we want to go to definitions, and here we have that physically based metal rough shader that we're using. Notice that we're also using parallax occlusion for right now. Okay, so that's going to allow us to use this height map. So now that we have this, I'm just going to come over here to this edit button, and I'm going to click this. And then here in my 3D view properties, you can see that we have this material height scale. Now by default, it's going to have a value of 0. So here I'll just kind of rotate this model a little bit here so that we can see this at a glancing angle. And I'll take this height value and I'll just increase it a bit. And what this is doing is just showcasing a little bit here of this kind of parallax occlusion from this height that we're getting. We'll just leave it all at default for now, but that's how we can utilize some parallax occlusion here within the shader. So before we finish up this material, I want to address the transparency here that we're getting in our normal map. So as you can see here in Designer, this is no problem, everything's working, but if we just export this texture, then we could run into some issues. So I want to show you a way to fix this. Now, throughout the video, I've been showing that we can just hit this Enable Alpha Image button just to view the image without the alpha. But let's just get rid of it. So a way to do that here is I'm just going to select my connection node. Okay, so this is going to basically allow me to insert a node just right before our output. And what I'm going to do here is just grab a levels. Now let me just take this levels node and just place it close here to the output. Again, so we can just kind of get a visual idea of how this is going to work or how this is going to be organized here in our graph. Now with the levels selected, I'm going to come over here to the channel and I'm going to choose the alpha channel, and I'm just going to take my output black and just pull this all the way towards the right. And what that's going to do is basically just remove that alpha channel. So now I don't have to worry about there being any alpha issues. So at this stage, we finished our base material. What we've created is a corrugated metal with some rust. So let's take a break for now, and in the next video, we're going to finish things up by exposing a parameter and talking about publishing a substance.